Welcome to the Triage Method podcast with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, Patrick Farrell, all the way from Boise, Idaho. How are you this week, Patty?
I am positively fantastic. However, I should note that by the time people are listening to this,
Oh, yes.
I won't actually be in Boise. I think I will be, if
In
this
Cali, bro.
if this comes out in 2 weeks' time, essentially, I will be in San Diego. I'll be in there choking Jocko out in his gym, being like, shh, shh, shh. No tears now.
No tears now, Jocko. Should have lost that gut, Jocko.
No. But anyway, what are we going to talk about today, Gary?
Today we're going to talk about building muscle and losing fat. I actually don't think we've done a podcast on this before. We probably have. I don't know.
We've touched on it a few times when we discussed a few different of the diet ones, because this stuff that we're going to discuss today, the training stuff doesn't really change, but the diet stuff and how you approach it, and I will say the lifestyle stuff and how you approach it does change. So what are we discussing?
Yeah, so we're going to talk about body recomposition. And that is essentially what I would define as the process of building muscle and losing fat at the same time while staying relatively weight stable. And that's kind of a key point here, because some people use the phrase recomp or recomposition to mean, when they're just dieting down and then they're at a leaner point and that's kind of it. They're like, oh yeah, look, this was body recomposition. But specifically what we're talking about is that process of recomposition where someone is, eating more or less around maintenance over a long period of time. And while they may see some slight changes in their weight, they are essentially undertaking both processes at the same time, losing fat and gaining muscle. So that's kind of the focus of the discussion, but also with, add-on points related to, if you are that person, you want to do both, what's the best way of going about it? Is this kind of maintenance approach best for you? Who might that be useful for? And how do you go about setting goals? Like we discussed in the last podcast, or 2 podcasts ago, how do you take that information about goal setting and apply it to this context where you just don't know what to do? You want to gain muscle, but you also want to lose fat, like all of us. So that's the context.
Yeah, and what you just said there is a very key point, that recomposition, body recomposition, is recomposing the body in terms of the composition, the body fat, the lean muscle. You are literally changing the composition, right? And what people mean by that is you are staying relatively at the same weight and losing fat and gaining muscle. That's generally what the given definition is. However, people do kind of put shades within that, and what they'll say, like you were saying, is people will actually be in a fat loss phase, and because we'll say even in their fat loss phase they gained a kilo of muscle, which would be ridiculous in itself, but they'll call that a recomposition then, or people will just be in a pure fat loss phase, and because they lost 10 pounds or whatever and now they look like they're bigger, they'll be like, oh yeah, I really recomposed the body, I gained muscle and I lost fat. In reality they just maintained their muscle and lost fat. So what body recomposition means, I don't think there's a fucking Webster dictionary definition of it, and what people see propagated online or discussed online are 2 different things generally. A body recomposition, in my mind at least, means that you stay relatively the same body fat, or sorry, not body fat, body weight. You might lose a kilo or gain a kilo, but you've essentially stayed the same as you are right now, except you've lost fat and you've gained muscle, right? And at that, they've been pretty much at the same rate. So you end up being your same weight, but you have more muscle and less fat, right? So discussing this, it's actually a very easy thing to do, but it's also a very hard thing to do because people will have different definitions in their head, so we're going to have to run with the definition that we have in terms of you're ending up the same weight, but you've more muscle and less fat, And what you also said there was these 2 processes happening at the same time, which is not actually what's happening, right? These processes are happening at different times. Now, this goes into a very deeper, like, mechanistic thing, which, if you describe it superficially, it can seem like it's an on-off switch, but that's just not the case with the human body. It's like, yes, this stuff can be happening. The switch can be turned on in this part of the body and turned off in this part of the body. And overall, that can be a net positive, negative, whatever way you view things, you know? So gaining muscle and losing fat, they're two different pathways, you know? So like we can get into the mechanistic stuff, but I actually don't think it helps the discussion overall. Like, we have articles on site about it. It's like, if you look up the AMPK and mTOR articles, like you can read deeper into that if you want. But essentially, the processes of losing fat are antagonistic to the processes of gaining muscle. So when you're discussing losing fat and gaining muscle at the same time, you can only look at that at a larger time scale. And what I mean by that is, over, say, the course of 24 hours, there can be large sections where you're in a gaining muscle signal, right? And then there can be large sections when you're in a losing fat signal, you know? And this is really hard for people to fully grasp, even though they can kind of go, oh yeah, that makes sense, you know? Like, you see people sharing like studies or anecdotes or articles or whatever, where it's like, oh, well, I lose fat in the morning when I do my cardio, and then the rest of the day I can turn on the signal for muscle building, and they'll be like, oh yeah, like this clearly shows better fat oxidation, because there's a study that shows that. But it's like, if you understand the actual processes behind this, that's not what that study is actually showing, you know? So while this discussion is actually very complex at a mechanistic level, how that actually practically impacts you, it isn't actually that hard to do, right? And setting out a plan of action to achieve your goal isn't actually that hard to do, right? So where do we kind of start with this discussion, Gary? Like, what? Because obviously, well, we'll preface this, because we got a question in the group, which you should all be a part of. If you're not a part of the group, you're missing out on, I don't know, 99% of the content that we produce, you know, the discussions that we have. So like, obviously that should be your first port of call. Like, you should pause this if you're listening to it. I don't care if you're driving, pull over, join the Facebook group. Pause the video, join the Facebook group, you know? But this is a question from one of the guys in the Facebook group, because we asked for questions for the podcast. And essentially the question was along the lines of, you know, can you discuss the holy grail of recomping, building muscle and dropping body fat? And like, he trains guys, so he's talking about, like, you know, a large portion of the people that come to him, you know, that's kind of what they're looking for. And he was wondering how he should kind of set up things like
excuse me.
He's like discussing things like whether he should start with this kind of recomp phase, or should he like go into a fat loss phase, a gaining phase. He also wanted to know a little bit about, you know, is gaining muscle or going into a gaining phase when you're already at a higher body fat an issue? Like, is that something that we should try to not do? Like, should we diet first? Should we recomp first and then go into a gaining phase? And then essentially the conversation kind of steered towards, you know, the issue of like skinny fat, where you're kind of like, I don't have enough muscle, but I'm also fat. And I mean that as a subjective term. You know, you're like, I have too much body fat than I would like, you know? So, you know, that's obviously different for different people and different populations, but you just don't have enough muscle, but you also have too much body fat. So you're not like that wiry, lean, muscular, where it's like, yeah, okay, cool. Like, you clearly look fit, and, you know, you don't have a lot of body fat, but you don't have an awful lot of muscle. Whereas the other thing is where, like, you don't have an awful lot of muscle and you have too much body fat. So you kind of just are in that in-between stage. So that's the kind of preface for this discussion.
Yeah, so I think for those listening, it'd be helpful to lay down some background context here. So normally when we're talking about building muscle or losing fat, there's generally going to be a delineation between the two, as in people would approach one thing at a time. So, you know, if you're coming at this being like, oh, I'm new to this whole fitness thing, this is kind of the background context. So generally people will approach building muscle by over consuming calories. Okay, so they're eating more calories than their body requires in order to maintain their weight. Okay, very simple. You add in more calories, your body is in a more anabolic state overall, so you're more able to build new tissues, build new proteins, and in this case, build muscle, also build fat, but other things too. Build capillaries, build mitochondria, etc. You've got energy that can be allocated to lots of different tissues in the body, so it's not just about muscle either. So that's what happens when you overconsume calories. You've got more energy that you can allocate to those additional resources that you're going to be building, essentially. So that's why people would generally approach muscle building in that way. Then on the other side of the coin,
just on that point, it's like, and then if you just put in that signal of resistance training, it's like, okay, so I have this excess of calories, like I can use this to just gain body fat or whatever else, but we've got this extra stimulus that I have to adapt to. We're going to put some of those resources towards that. So like this just as an aside, like when people talk about the discussion, it's like, is diet more important than training? Is training more important than diet? It's like there can't be a delineation. Like, yes, like diet is more important because if you don't supply the energy needed to train, you can't train, and if you don't supply the energy needed to adapt to that training, it's like your training is always going to be shocking, but at the same time, it's like you can eat in a calorie surplus and you may gain some muscle, maybe on your calves, because, they're effectively doing resistance training as you get larger and larger. Didn't work for me, but whatever. But you need to provide that signal for your body to actually adapt, and that comes from training. So it's like these are not a either or argument. It's like these two things fit together to actually get you the end outcome. But anyway, sorry for interrupting.
You're fine. Yeah, so essentially what we're saying is that the background, like energy status, you could call it, of the diet is really, really important for setting the scene as to whether or not you're going to build muscle, not build muscle, lose fat or not lose fat. So on the other side of the coin, when people are trying to lose body fat, generally what they will do is eat less calories, which is just a measure of the energy in your diet, eat less calories than they require in order to maintain their weight. So then you begin to lose bodily tissue of some form. Ideally, you want that to be body fat as opposed to muscle, but there's always going to be some component of lean mass loss that mightn't even be the result of muscle. So there's other things that can account for that too. So that's like the background energy status stuff. But as Paddy alluded to there's also like additional inputs that contribute to anabolic or catabolic signaling. So like anabolic you can think of as like building up, catabolic you can think of as breaking down. So resistance training and protein feeding are two very potent stimuli for building muscle. So when you're thinking about like eating in a calorie deficit and losing body fat, it's not as simple as just the calories or the energy status, because if you don't have those inputs of sufficient protein or sufficient resistance training, which is really, really important, then you'd expect more of that weight loss to come from lean mass than from fat mass. So it's not just calories, it is about other things as well. And then you can take that again a step further and consider other things like the amount of stress in your life. If you're under a lot of stress at any given point, you're less likely to be building new muscle. So what you might find is that you build a little bit less muscle and gain more fat for a given calorie surplus, or you lose a little bit more muscle and a little bit less fat at a given calorie deficit. The same thing can be said for sleep deprivation, alcohol consumption, some drug use. Some drug use is going to lead to the opposite effect of more muscle building. But yeah, so there's lots of different things that are going on there. So you've got your background energy status, and then you've got different contributors to the anabolic or catabolic signaling pathways, and that's essentially the overall context. So then where things become interesting from a recomposition perspective is when you are at that kind of maintenance level. So you're eating enough calories to supply your body to just be able to maintain weight, but because you've essentially got your resistance training and your protein feedings as potent anabolic stimuli, you're still going to be building new proteins along your resistance training journey. And as you build up those new proteins, they're then using up more of the energy that's coming from that maintenance calorie level, and hence you're gradually, slowly losing a little bit of body fat, because that background like fat oxidation is taking place all the time. And if more of the energy is being diverted to something like muscle building, then that can lead to a recomposition effect over time. So yeah, that would be the way I think about it anyway. Do you think that's a fair summary of what's going on here?
Yeah, it's a good way to kind of contextualize things. It's basically like, as I said, like that kind of switch between anabolic and catabolic processes. And again, throughout a day, eating at a maintenance level, sometimes that switch for anabolic processes can be on, and sometimes that switch for catabolic processes can be on. And obviously, there's a magnitude. They're more like dimmer switches if you really want to think of it in a proper context. It's like, oh, sometimes we've turned the anabolic processes up a little bit and turned the catabolic ones down a little bit, and we can see over time it's like, oh, the anabolic ones are slightly going up, oh, the catabolic ones are actually slightly going up as well at different points of the day. So it's like at the end of it, how that affects the body is like muscle mass slowly but surely goes up, and then fat mass slowly but surely goes down, so when people ask, like, is building muscle and losing fat at the same time possible? Not directly at the same time, but over a time scale, yes. So the holy grail of recomping, 100% possible, right? So the question becomes, like, is it something that you should actually aim for? Like we can sit here all day and just fucking circle jerk each other off and talk about different mechanistic stuff and go like, oh, well, yeah, this, and what about this, and how this interplays with it. But at the end of the day, it just comes down to eating at roughly a maintenance calorie level and resistance training, like providing all the inputs that you would if you were trying to build muscle or lose fat, and essentially try to do that while eating at a calorie maintenance level. So the real question is it something that we should look to actually achieve? Is it something that's going to help us over the long haul? Is it something that is a good starting point? Because that was essentially the question. It's like, well, I have people that are either skinny fat, or they have muscle, but they have a little bit too much fat, but they still want to gain muscle. Should we focus on recomping first and then go from there? Or like, when is a recomping phase, we'll call it, appropriate, right? So that's essentially the question we're left with. But before we get onto that, I just want to touch on something else, because this is something that you see, which again muddies the water. And we're actually going to do a podcast on something similar. Well, yeah, essentially this concept at another time. But the concept of the fitness industry actually lies, right, in terms of what they do. Because what you'll see is this concept is propagated, but it'll be discussed in the context of like, oh, we did this with the diet and we did this with training, and here was the result. And it can kind of look like, Jesus, this person lost body fat and gained muscle. Like, obviously this approach is wonderful, but they just don't mention the fact that it's like, oh, we were on X, Y, and Z drugs. It's like these, like we were talking about, these anabolic processes and catabolic processes and whatever. It's like, if you just give this stimulus that is incredibly anabolic, like the discussion we're having now is almost null and void, because you've just given this hyper signal. So the anabolic processes are switched right the fuck on. Because you're giving a drug that does that. So you can essentially be building muscle even in a deficit, purely because you're on drugs. And you see this all the time as well when people discuss like coming into a contest prep. They'll be like, oh, I grew into the show. It's like you never see a natural athlete saying I grew into the show. They might be like, well, I hadn't been training my rear delts that much during my off season, and I kind of started, when I lost a little bit of fat, I noticed that they weren't really that full, so I started training them more often, and I think I added a tiny bit of muscle onto it. But overall they're still like, yeah, I lost 30-40 pounds in preparing for this competition. Whereas you'll see people who are in enhanced divisions and they're like, yeah, no, I actually gained 5 kilos in this prep of like from my starting weight. They'll be like, oh, I started dieting at 95 kilos and on competition day I was 100 kilos, and they're like, yeah, I lost, like, we'll say 10% body fat. And you're like, how the fuck is that even possible? But again, you have to factor in, it's like you use a load of drugs to get to that point. So the anabolic and catabolic signaling is completely skewed in a direction. Because again, like just imagine you're eating at maintenance and you're kind of like, oh, anabolic, you've got your resistance training and you've got your protein feedings and calories to an extent, although they are kind of at maintenance. And then you've got some catabolic processes, but those catabolic processes can, like the fat oxidation we'll say, can kind of go way up because you've provided this extraordinary anabolic stimulus, right? So you're not providing enough calories to actually get that. So you're actually eating at a deficit, but because these anabolic processes are so high, the deficit comes from the fat stores that you have, So like it is more nuanced once you start talking and throwing drugs into the mix, and that's unfortunately what you see a lot of information put out in the fitness industry, but it's just not touched on. It's like, oh, like this, of course, recomping is easy. Like you see this all the time. People who use drugs will say stuff like that. It's like, yeah, like, oh, I just did this little recomp phase. And again, they're like, yeah, I gained like 3 kilos and lost a load of fat. And that can make it seem to you that, oh, this is a real possibility to make some like substantial changes to someone's physique. And you'll also see this as well with people coming off like a period of time where they're not training. They'll be like, oh, well, I haven't really been training for the last 3 months. Maybe they were out fucking exploring, adventuring on holidays, whatever the fuck. Maybe they just didn't want to train, And then they'll be like, oh, like, this is what I did to get back in shape. And it looks like they just did this unbelievable recomp phase. But all they really did was lose some fat while they were building old muscle tissue, So like that concept of like muscle memory is a thing. Now, to what magnitude we can sit here all day and try to parse that out, but it is a thing. So gaining muscle that you've previously lost does seem to be easier than gaining new tissue, So you'll also see that from those people that are like, yeah, I haven't been training. Well, they won't really approach it like that. They'll just be like, oh, I just did a little recomp phase and it'll look like they gained 10 kilos of muscle while losing 10 kilos of fat, So you do have to, when you're looking at this information out there, or if you're looking up the term of like body recomposition, you have to be aware that there are different populations that are going to be able to do this better than other populations. And that's generally people who are on anabolics and people who are coming off, say, an injury or a period of time where they haven't been training, So you do have to overlay that onto the overall conversation, because I know people are going to listen to this and be like, nah, these guys they don't know the secrets. This guy I follow on Instagram, he shows the way, like he's done it, or like I know someone that did this, and it's like, yeah, but when you look at the actual situation, it either involves drugs or it involves a period of time of not training and then starting training again, Or again, like there is the other one where it's like you've just been ticking along with training and it hasn't been that intensive, and then all of a sudden you kick training up a gear. You really dial down on the diet, the health parameters, we'll call your sleep, your relaxation, your stress management, all those things. Like you tidy up all of these peripheral factors, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, my body composition just changed completely. And it's because you played around with the variables, even though you were eating the same calories,
Yes, sir. So that brings us to the who, who is this process going to be useful for? And like primarily from my perspective, the deliberate attempt to like more or less maintain while trying to build muscle and lose body fat is primarily reserved for those beginners, primarily beginners or individuals after a layoff from training, as you said, or post-injury, any one of those contexts where you're either new or you're coming back from a period away from training or injury or illness or anything along those lines that could have led you to have gone away from where you previously were. So they are the main context in which this can work, but that doesn't mean that it still doesn't mean it's the best idea. At the same time,
there is actually another one as well, but it's almost peripheral to this discussion. Like it's what I call a maintenance phase, where it's like we're really just at maintenance, but if we can gain some strength, if we can gain some muscle, happy days, you know. And that would be mainly for, say, an in-season athlete, you know, where it's like we're kind of just
Yes.
eating that maintenance, and like if we get some body recomposition going on, happy days. It's not really our focus. Our focus is to kind of support your training, but they essentially always fall into that kind of thing where like the discussion is actually the same discussion as the body recomposers, you know, where it's like, yeah, we're basically just eating that maintenance. You know, some days we might have more because you have a very important match or game or training session or whatever, you know, so we're trying to ensure that you're fueled for that as 100% adequately as you can. But with training and overall nutrition, it's like we're kind of looking to maybe get a little bit stronger, but the main focus is just to kind of keep you injury free and keep you, you know, ticking along with strength, keep muscle mass there, you know, that kind of way. So they're kind of peripheral to this overall discussion. I kind of think they always get glanced over as if it's a different thing, but it is essentially, it is the same thing.
Yep, that's more or less what I do a lot of the time, to be honest. Just kind of staying like around the same weight. Like, and if I gain strength and muscle, cool. If not, I'm not going to be too upset about it either, because obviously we go on.
Yeah, this is also, if you look at the article series, because we basically have an entire article series discussing diet for this. So if you look at that article, it's the tier 3 diet in the nutrition section, and like we literally talk you through what we're going to talk through now in a second. But we also, in that last article of that series, it's like I think it's called the long-term calorie appropriate diet, and it's essentially
lifetime calorie appropriate diet.
Lifetime calorie appropriate diet, you know, and essentially what we're discussing, you know, you'll get to a stage where you're like I'm probably not going to gain a ridiculous amount of strength. I'm probably not going to gain a ridiculous amount of muscle. You know, maybe you've been training for 5 years, 10 years, you know, but you still want to be able to progress in whatever way you can, you know. And again, with the diet, it's like, well, like I don't want to be going through these huge bulk phases or cutting phases. I'd like to just, you know, be happy in my physique year round, whatever body fat level that is for you, you know. And that's again where this kind of, we'll call it a maintenance phase comes in. And essentially that's where most people, once they've been training and eating in a nutritionally adequate manner for a while, that's eventually where they kind of end up. And this is what you see, unfortunately, again, on like social media. It's like people will have been training for 10 years and then they'll explode on social media. And it's like, well, what they're doing now is not what they were doing to get to that point. You know, you'll see them and they're lean year round. And it's like, yeah, well, they've been training for 10 years. They've gone through these gaining phases where they got fat. They've gone through these phases where they got exceptionally lean. They've done that back and forth and gaining, losing. And then they kind of like, oh, well, like I'm not getting a huge return on either of those things. So I'm just going to kind of stay at the calorie level that I deem appropriate for me and the body fat level that I enjoy or deem appropriate for me. And again, like that kind of gets pushed into the ether of the fitness sphere, and you're kind of like, oh, well, like they just eat roughly at maintenance and they seem to be shredded all year round, so that's what I have to do there, you know. And basically you follow that template when it's like that's not what got them to where they are now. But anyway, sorry, go on, Gary.
Yeah, and just that you bring up those points there's another example worth considering here that can kind of put things into perspective, because like I think that, like, you know, the last few years, obviously more and more people are coming to notice that, oh, you know, calories actually are important, and most of, you know, the body composition outcomes that we're seeking tend to be related to changing your calories in some way, whether it's fat loss or muscle building, as we've discussed. But that can be really reduced into this simple idea that it's all about average calories over time, and hence it just doesn't really matter when you eat them. You know, it's just not important at all. And you can see how this plays out. Like, because I was actually asked this before, like when someone asked, you know, if I bulk for 12 months and then I diet for 6 months, like, or diet for 12 months as well, the same period of time, let's say, like, how's that not the same as me just maintaining over all that period of time, you know, and not ever getting into a surplus? or a deficit. You know, people ask questions like that, but a really good example to try and that should make sense to a lot of people is if you think about like a bodybuilder coming out of a show, right? And they're super lean, they're absolutely shredded. What happens some people after their show is they get into this binge restrict cycle. And some of you may have experienced that independent of ever competing in bodybuilding. So you get into this binge restrict cycle where, let's say, you binge like so hard on a Saturday and Sunday, which might be your rest days. You binge super hard and then you like starve yourself for the week. But over the course of the week, you're still in a net surplus and you begin gaining body fat. But you end up gaining pretty much only like body fat because you've never fueled your sessions midweek. You're always starving midweek. You're like in this massive deficit. You're really like down in energy and training and everything. And then you're in this massive surplus at the weekend. So you're in a net surplus over time, but you're very, very unlikely to build as much muscle in that case as you would if you actually overfed across the week evenly where you're fueling each of your sessions. So I think that's one of the points that gets lost in these discussions is that nutrition, while it is important to look at averages over time, it's still important to remember that there are these pathways like we've mentioned that are actually facilitating all these changes. And the reason we use energy status, like, or an energy quantifier, you could say, as our unit is because like you can only calculate so much. You know, like we've got that article on site that you wrote, Paddy, about why we measure calories and not ATP, because like things are really complicated under the hood. So it's very important not to take sound bites like, oh, it's all calories, and just think that it actually is just all average calories over time, and it doesn't really matter otherwise, because things are dynamic. But anyway, yeah. So they're the people that are likely to benefit from something like body recomposition. You know, as we said, those beginners, people after layoffs from training or injury, and people who are maybe not overly pushed about gaining muscular strength in the short term. They're kind of in it. They're in a situation where weight maintenance is ideal for their sport. Maybe it's for a weight class, something along those lines. You could even make the case that it could be useful for someone like a powerlifter who just wants to stay in that specific weight, where they're not moving away from their weight class at all. And I've spoken to one powerlifter who actually did that for like 3 years, just stayed like at the same weight, and you know had repeat DEXAs and stuff. And obviously there's problems with that, but when you're getting them constantly and there's consistent changes, you can be like, okay, there's probably something to it. But he lost body fat and gained muscle over time, but it's a really long-term thing. So the reason it's not as simple as saying, all right, all beginners should go and just do body recomposition, is that it's one of the biggest problems is that it's really difficult to measure. Okay. And trying to measure your progress is like, firstly, when you are a beginner, a big part of your buy-in is the fact that you are seeing progress. So for example, if fat loss is the goal, like, although it's good to try and not get too attached to it, people love seeing the difference on the scales. They love seeing the difference in their weekly progress pics. And I know like some of my clients, when they check in, they're like, oh, it's such a good week. I'm actually so motivated now to have another good week, because that kind of builds on itself. So if you first get into the gym and you hire like myself or Paddy as your trainer, and we're doing this recomposition thing, and we say to you, yeah, you're definitely going to notice like some fat loss and muscle gain, but it might take a couple of months for us to notice something. And before there's a meaningful difference, it could be 6 months. You're kind of like, oh, I don't know about that. So you don't get that initial buy-in, and you don't really know if you're moving in the right direction, because you don't have the scales or the mirror really to tell you whether or not things are changing. And even in that case, using things like measurements is also quite difficult, because you can't really tell like what is the difference in fat mass and what is the difference in muscle mass, since they're to some degree moving in different directions despite different volumes, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, measurement error, big difficult thing there, especially from the perspective of reinforcing your adherence. So that's one of the biggest problems that I see. Do you have anything to add there to that, Paddy?
Yeah, this is also, I suppose you could actually lump this into the populations that this might be applicable for, and that would be small females, right? Because while what Gary's saying is right there in terms of, you know, if you're coming to the gym and you're a beginner and you're kind of like, oh, I want to see progress faster because, again, it's motivating. Like, fat loss is the easiest way to go about it. Muscle gain just takes a huge amount of time, right? However, if you're a small female, right, you could definitely, and we'll say you have body fat that you wish to lose, right? You could definitely go into a fat loss phase, right? Like just an all-out diet phase. Like if we gain muscle, happy days. If we don't, not too big a deal, right? However, that can often lead to an excessive focus on like excessively low calories, like to lose the body fat because you are so small. Like say you're just 50 kilo female, you sit down for most of the day. Like to get you to lose significant levels of body fat, calories are going to have to go down quite low, or activity is going to have to go up quite high, So those individuals in that category, I sometimes just put them into this body recomposition category where it's like, yeah, like we're not going to get this significant fat loss right out the gate. Like we can, if that's what you want to focus on, we can, but you have to realize that it's going to be relatively hard with calories, like sticking to a low calorie amount, especially if you haven't been dieting before, you've never succeeded in dieting. Like putting you in this body recomposition, while it's less motivating week to week, can actually be what's necessary in terms of your long-term progress, where we're still actually dieting. So like this is what I'm saying, you could almost put it into this, like we're not actually trying to body recompose. Like we're actively dieting, but we're trying to keep calories ever so slightly below maintenance, where we're kind of coaxing fat loss, where it's like, yeah, like some weeks there's not going to be a huge amount, but we're still fueling enough so that your training sessions are good, but we are at a slight calorie deficit, so body fat is trending down over time. However, if you've never trained before, or you've never really structured your training, again, you do fall into that beginner category where it's like you are going to be building some muscle during this time, and even though females do have we'll call it a harder time building muscle, like their magnitude of ability to build muscle is slightly lower. You can see this kind of body recomposition over time where we're not actually just, this is a dieting phase. It's like we're slowly losing body fat. Yes, we're in a calorie deficit, but we are still fueling enough so that these, we'll call them anabolic processes, are still going on. So whatever you said there a second ago, just kind of take that off in my head, where I was like, that population does actually kind of fit into this overall discussion.
Yeah, and I think like the important thing to point out there as well is the fact that you can absolutely, like while in a calorie deficit, you can still build muscle, and that's something a lot of people do forget when they're thinking about this body recomposition thing. They're like, right, it has to be like at maintenance, and obviously that's the initial definition that we gave, but you can still that's the problem, is that people don't realize that if you actually are in a deficit, you can still build muscle. So they think that that's not an option, but that is an option. Like if you are someone who is, like, let's say you have excess body fat and that you'd like to lose, or you should probably lose for the reasons of health, then that is an option. Just to go into a deficit to lose body fat and gain muscle at the same time. As in there's plenty of research that has shown that, and sometimes I would say it probably even underestimates the effect because of lean mass losses that aren't muscle being interpreted sometimes as them actually being muscle. So yeah, you can definitely see muscle gain, especially again if you're that beginner. If you're someone who has an excess of body fat, like the more fat you have on your body, generally the more likely you're probably going to be able to get away with building a bit of muscle while in the deficit. Like if you're already like really really lean, like that's fairly unlikely because you're moving into low energy availability territory, which comes with its own problems. So like if you're 8% body fat and you're like, yeah, I'm going to diet to like 5% and gain muscle, like not happening, man. So yeah, like that is possible to get into that deficit and to gain muscle. And if you are that person who's really hesitant to get into a deficit because you think, oh, I don't think I could gain any muscle, or I don't think I'm going to gain strength, then that's definitely worth reminding yourself of, especially if you're in your beginner years. So yeah, the other thing about the body recomposition is not just measurement, but it's also a bit of a risk in that you're kind of end up spinning your wheels, and like there's no guarantee that you'll make a good bit of progress. In that if you are, let's say, someone who is more resistant to training, we'll say, You're more resistant to adaptations to training. You're just starting out training. You don't know what dose is required. You could spend those first few months trying to figure out, all right, what programming do we actually need to start making progress? And you could make very little progress just because of you as an individual. Like, you just don't have a massive response like some people do. And having that energy surplus in your favor would be like a really good idea to push you in the right direction, because essentially like different individuals have different levels of anabolic potential, and you can bring that down to the level of one's genetics, but also lifestyle as well, which is so huge. Like, everyone thinks that, oh, it's just my genetics, but it's also the case that we talk about this all the time, like, about, are you a really, really busy student who's also working like 2 jobs to fund your college fees? That's a very different context to someone who might be totally stress-free, sleeping enough all the time, lots of anabolic potential as a result of that. So that all modifies your exercise adaptation. So if you don't have a lot of things in your favor in terms of moving forward, then I would be trying to use as many things as possible. So I'd be using that calorie surplus, if possible, or that calorie deficit, depending on the goal, to push you in the right direction. So that's definitely worth keeping in mind, especially if you're, let's say, 3 to 6 months into this kind of maintaining process, and you're like, I look the exact same. My training hasn't changed at all. Nothing is moving. Like, you need as many of those anabolic things on your side as possible.
Yeah, so I think we should discuss the skinny fat stuff and then just kind of lay out a plan of action.
Yeah.
For this whole body recomposition thing, or if it is actually a good thing to do. So with the concept of like skinny fat, where you don't have enough muscle but you have too much body fat for your liking, it's a pretty straightforward process to actually address. However, it can kind of seem like this is the population that would benefit the most from this body recomposition thing, because it seems like this is exactly what they need. They don't have an awful lot of muscle. They have too much body fat. So they should be able to build more muscle, because they're at already a deficit of muscle, and they're at an excess of fat. So it can seem like this population would respond the best to some sort of body recomposition template program. And to an extent, that's right. But also, if someone is coming to you with a low level of muscle mass, and a high level of body fat, it comes down to a kind of a needs analysis. It's like, what do we actually need to do to actually impact change in this individual, both from an aesthetic point of view, a body composition point of view, but also a health and performance point of view, right? Because this, and you did touch on it a second ago, like when we discuss all of this stuff, whether, like you were saying with that individual who's like, if I just gained for a year and then dieted for a year, is that the same as just maintaining for a year, in terms of the outcomes? And like, obviously to an extent it is, because you're still providing those stimuli, but at the same time it's also not, because like these things are cumulative, right? And we'll get to that in a second when we discuss kind of body fat levels, and like, because the guy who asked this question was looking at like, the body fat percentage to start at, the gaining phase, the losing phase, and all that kind of stuff. But this stuff is cumulative, so it's not just how you actually set things up, right? You have to take into account that we're not just this closed system that it's like, oh, how much fuel will I put in my car? Like, because essentially you can think of it like that. If you put in an excess amount of fuel in your car, it's like, yeah, how does your car run then? And if you then put in just not enough fuel in your car, how does your car run then? Now, obviously that's not a perfect analogy, because there's no deficit in energy, but essentially there is. If you just attach an extra tank onto your car, and for 12 months you filled up your car and the tank, right? And then for the next 12 months it's like you only ever filled up your car. It's like that tank would obviously slowly start going down, the tank that you filled up over the year, right? But it's like that's not the full story of the argument, even just with the car analogy, because it's like, okay, well, when you're gaining, now you've got this extra tank to carry around, and that's you're using more fuel, right? And this again comes down to that kind of neat argument, that non-exercise activity thermogenesis. Like, this is also when people say like, oh, I have a slow metabolism, that's why I gain weight. It's like, well, if you weigh more just by virtue of, first of all, eating more and weighing more, like your metabolism is higher than someone who eats less and weighs less, you know, just by virtue of those two things, presuming that your exercise or your non-exercise activity is the same, you know, because if you weigh 100 kilos, you walking around, you're burning through more calories, you know, like you ever see these people that like get up to like 400 pounds, like if you put them in like a metabolic ward where you're like, oh, let's see how many calories they burn in an hour of playing, I don't know, fucking bowling or something. It's like the most intense calorie burn that you could ever hope to get, like you, Gary, on a treadmill or whatever. Like they're burning through like fucking 3,000 calories playing an hour game of bowling. But it's because they weigh 400 pounds. They have to constantly like carry that around, you know? So your metabolism is actually higher if you are overweight, or you are bigger, I should just say, really. So what was I saying before that? Oh, the gas tank, you know. So if you're like, if you fill up that gas tank and you have that constantly full, like you have to think of like all the other things like I want to go around with this. It's not the exact same as like, oh well, yeah, I spent a year filling this gas tank up and driving around with that. It's like that puts more strain on your car, your joints, the joints of the car, the suspension, all that kind of stuff, right? And then again, if you spent a year just like slowly ticking into that thing, it's like by the end of that, it's like, yeah, okay, we ended up at the same point that we would have done if we just only filled up the car. But the difference in the wear and tear on the body, we'll say, even though like I don't really like using that terminology, but the difference in how the car has experienced that year, or you driving the car has experienced that year, is completely different. And it's the same with humans. It's like you can't just look at the calories and expect like, oh, we're a closed system. You know, it's like, no, you have to look into how does this affect you psychologically? How does this affect you like overall physiologically? And how does this affect you just on that kind of, like, I know you like to use the terminology and I don't, but that kind of biopsychosocial whatever, you know, like being in a deficit where you're eating fuck all calories is a completely different experience than if you were in a surplus eating more calories. Even from a social perspective, like eating more calories allows you more ability to socialize. You know, most socializing events involve food of some sort, you know? So it's like, even down to that kind of stuff, it's like all of this stuff does matter, you know, like you have to take it into account. Like, so this is again where you, like, if you go back to that podcast we did on like the calories in, calories out argument versus hormones, it's like we touched on a few of these things, but it's like you actually have to think way deeper than just this superficial like calories in, calories out argument when you actually want to discuss something that is as nuanced as this body recomposition stuff, you know?
Yep, you're some biopsychosocialist. The
It's a terrible model, but anyway.
It's not a model.
It actually is a model. They just had to change that after they said that because it didn't work. But anyway, go on.
It's not a model, and it's never been implemented because it's not a model.
Because it doesn't work.
Friedrich, no, because Mr. Engel never even formalized it as a model. He introduced the concept.
Oh, so it's just a vague concept. Makes sense.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, it is vague.
I'm just going to make up vague concepts and be like, yeah, of course we should apply these in a medical setting.
Exactly, yeah.
Makes sense.
But anyway, we can talk about, I hate arguing for other people against your straw men. But anyway, what I was going to say is that an interesting thought experiment to consider, just because we're here and you mentioned it, is how weight loss and gain could affect something like your squat strength. Because I think this is interesting to consider with reference to like how let's say maximal voluntary isometric contraction, your maximal strength that's often measured in the sports science lab, is like it's basically an isometric knee extension on a dynamometer essentially. So you do that, and then you're only essentially extending your knee. You never actually have to lift the mass of your leg. Whereas if you do something like a squat, you're actually also lifting your body weight to some degree. Like you can break it down at what's actually happening at each joint, like but you're lifting more mass as you actually get.
Just on that point, that's why I always say my squats are infinitely more impressive than everyone else's, because essentially you're never going to be lifting your calves in your squat. So we'll say for most people that's 80% of their body weight, you know, everything above the knee. But for me, that's 99% of my body weight. So whatever weight I have on the bar, it's just always more impressive.
Yeah, so what I was thinking is, like, if you basically just if you lost 40 kilos of body weight, and like this is why it's funny when people are like, oh, I only maintain my strength. I wanted to gain so much strength. If you lost, like, let's say 40 kilos of body weight, and then you still like maintained your actual squat, then like think about what's actually happened there. As in, like, you're technically lifting wait, what would you be lifting? You'd be lifting far less weight overall. So it's weird. It's weird to think about that stuff. But anyway, you can think about that another time and think about how heavy. This is why I'm so strong on those lateral raises. My arms are just so skinny. It's just too easy. Or would that make me? Yeah, that make me strong. There you go. Anyway, back to the point.
The weight you lift is not actually what it seems always.
Exactly. Yeah, that's kind of the point.
This is also something that this is one of the reasons I like body weight exercises, because they keep you honest, right? And it's also something that you'll see people make ludicrous claims on, because like they'll do this with body weight exercises because it's easy. Like you'll have someone that is 60 kilos and they'll be like, oh, I did a chin up with 20 kilos attached to my body. They'll be like, I did sets of 8 with 20 kilos attached to my body, and it's like, yeah, that's cool, but like I weigh 100 kilos just as a baseline. So even me just doing body weight chin ups is a completely different, like I've already overloaded then like 20 kilos more than you just with body weight, So when you compare like like body weight movements, it's like you have to compare like your weight plus the weight that you're adding to it. And then all of a sudden you see people be like, oh Jesus, like this is completely different. And this is also why you see then people who are, say, like fucking 200 kilos, they're like strongman competitors. It's like, yeah, of course they struggle to do chin-ups. It's like they're literally, like, imagine I just lashed on 105 kilos or whatever, because I weigh 95-ish kilos, and just did chin-ups with that. Like, be ridiculous. So while obviously it's like that relative versus absolute strength, it's like I personally think that it makes it easier to compare when you discuss body weight movements, However, if you're dipping 5 plates, I'm like, that's impressive whether you weigh 60 kilos or 200 kilos.
Yeah, but yeah, no, that was just a little add-on point for you guys to consider when you're thinking about things like strength. There's actually like so much going on under the hood and above the hood that people often don't even think about. Like you can go down to like internal moment arms of the tendons, like pennation angle, like how much muscle you already have, how it grows, where it grows. It's all mad stuff. But anyways, sure, that's also fairly irrelevant.
Just on that stuff as well. It's like, as you change your body composition, some exercises may benefit more than other exercises. Like we were saying before this, like, I was saying before, it's probably easier to get relatively more strong on the bench press by gaining weight than it is to lose weight, Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is, like, if you just got up to, like, it's more likely that you would bench 200 kilos if you weighed more, which is fairly, well, or rather, I should not say 200 kilos. It's probably easier to get a double body weight bench if you weighed more than if you weighed less, right? Even though that would seem counterintuitive. But you have to remember, it's like, well, the bench press is a certain range of motion. So if you lose a load of fat, like even if it's just fat, and you're like, oh, fat is non-contractile tissue. Like if you lose a load of fat off your chest and off your back, it's like that range of motion is now increased. So you're actually doing more work. So like I was saying, it's like you have to factor that in when you're losing weight. It's like, oh, well, I only maintained my bench press strength. And it's like, well, maybe you actually got stronger because, you're working through a slightly bigger range now because, you've lost an inch off your chest, so it's like, it's a little bit of a harder conversation. But the same goes the opposite way. It's like, well, if you gained 5 inches onto your chest purely from fat, it's like, well, you now have to bench 5 less inches. So did you actually get stronger, or did you just?
But you've got those big fat arms to carry as well. Got to lift those fat arms.
Like it's incredibly nuanced, and
yeah,
it's hard to compare different individuals, and this is why eventually it all just comes down to, like, are you as an individual getting stronger over time, and how does your strength compare at different body weights to where you were in the past, you know? So yeah, like as an anecdote, like I always find my squat gets stronger as I diet. You know, I find it easier to get into the right positions. That's not to say that gaining, like being in a surplus, doesn't make my squat stronger. What I mean is, like, the actual experience of squatting feels easier, and I'm able to slowly but surely continue to get stronger as I get leaner. You know, and that's purely, I presume, because like I'm losing fat on my hips and around my knees or whatever, and it just allows a better position for me. But you could also make the argument for other individuals that if they lose weight in the squat, like their entire squat is going to go to fucking shit, because, you know, their squat is always trying to close a book on a tennis ball because they have this huge like power belly, and they always use that. So as soon as that's gone, it's like, well, my squat is gone, you know? But anyways.
Yeah, man, my squat feels horrible when I diet because my legs always get really lean, like really fast. So it's like there's just nothing there anymore. You just suddenly have this extra like 6 inches of range of motion where your fat hamstrings used to touch your fat calves, but not anymore. But anyway,
this just goes back to why my squats are more impressive, Gary. Because I have no calves, so even when my hamstrings are touching my calves, that has to be factored in. You know,
it's literally just all Achilles tendon. That's all it is.
That's all I have. Like, there's this little, like, you know, tiny calf at the top that just goes, like, that's why it's so strong. It just goes, and this tendon just goes.
It's the way it works.
Well, I mean,
but yeah, let's get back on track. I'm not even sure where we were. We started talking about how there's a difference in the time course relative to your calories. Like if you're thinking of those two things, like your calorie change over time, where calories are distributed does matter on a, you know, you can think of it on a daily basis, but what we were talking about is like on a monthly and yearly basis. It's not just all the same. So yeah, you can't just treat humans as like really simple systems. And like, while it's really nice to say, oh, it's all just calories, like you said, you know, social factors come into it. You know, you can think of psychological factors related to training, which are a huge one. Like I know loads of people who eating at maintenance, like they're still hungry. Like they're still hungry a good portion of the time. And when you're hungry, like that's going to change your affect towards training. You know, you're going to have a different perspective on training if you're hungry, because that's a low level stressor that's on your mind to some degree. Not necessarily harmful, but some people are affected by it more than others. And if that's on your mind in training, like all you want to do is go and eat, you know? So it's a different ball game. It's not just as simple as saying, calories full.
And the hard thing to really discuss is it's going to be different for everyone, and the only way you can experience this is to actually experience this. You know, for example, like I'll use myself. Like I find eating at maintenance, like I don't feel like I'm completely fueled. Like when I'm eating a surplus, I feel a certain way when I'm like, oh yeah, like I have more fuel, I can feel like I have more energy, go to the gym, feel great, blast it, whatever. But then if I eat at maintenance, I don't quite feel that. I kind of feel hungry all the time as well. Whereas if we did a calorie deficit, like I don't feel hungry. Like obviously those processes tick up and I'm like in this like zone, like I feel very focused, I feel whatever. But if I eat at maintenance, for me, I'm like, I don't feel like I have this extra energy, but I also feel kind of hungry. Like I feel hungrier at maintenance than I do in a deficit, you know? So the only way you can ever experience that or know that about yourself is to actually go out and experience it. So do you have anything else to add? Because I'm just going to go straight into things.
No, I think that's a good little add-on point, and I would agree. Go on.
So,
go on, lad.
When we're actually thinking about how do we approach this, because ultimately this is the question. Like we've just fucking faffed around for however long this is, and ultimately what we actually want to discuss is what should your plan of action be? So I'm going to give a few examples, and we'll kind of start talking through them, because then you can see like, okay, so that's roughly where I fall in, and that's roughly what I should do, you know? So first of all, we have articles on the site. They're in tier 3. They should form your foundation. Read them. You're going to get way more in depth than we're going to discuss here. So I might go off on a few tangents here that you might not get in the articles, but if you just want the plan of action, it's all there, right? So for most people coming to us that have the goal of improving their physique over time, right? You are more likely or most likely going to start with some sort of fat loss phase, right? And again, obviously it depends on the individual. Like they come to us and they're 6% body fat. You know, I'm not going to be like, oh, we have to lose fat first, you know, but the vast majority of people will say they're in a relatively okay body fat percentage, and they want to gain muscle over time, gain strength, gain whatever, right? I like to use the range of, for guys, that kind of, we'll say 8 to 15% body fat, right? That's the range I want to see people stay in for the most of their life, right? So if someone comes to me, they're roughly 25% body fat. And again, like, we're not like going over there with the calipers or getting them to get DEXA scans, like just a visual inspection, be like, this is where we're at with body fat, right? The first thing I'm going to do is bring them into some sort of deficit. And again, we can set up training so that we're maybe achieving some sort of that body recomposition where, you know, we're building a little bit of muscle. But like Gary was saying before, you know, we want to get that buy-in first of all, where it's like, okay, we can actually see that we're moving towards somewhere, and we can actually see how your body actually looks without the body fat. And obviously this is going to improve health overall, right? So you have two approaches with this. And it doesn't mean that one is inherently better than the other, and you can obviously be staggered with these as well. So I'm going to come to it from those two perspectives. You can have the guy who comes to you with 25% body fat. So you can bump it into a deficit first of all, right? And over time, purely by cleaning up the diet, purely by, you know, starting training, they might be building some muscle and they might be losing some body fat. Once they get down to that kind of, we'll say 15% body fat range, like around there, you know, you can make an argument that we'll do some sort of maintenance, some sort of diet break. They've already lost 10% body fat. They're at the higher end of that, we'll call it the health range. Again, like these numbers are supported, but it's also obviously very individualized for you. You know, you might find like, oh, I feel best, look my best, whatever, at 18%. And again, like I'm not getting you to do a DEXA scan or calipers or fucking buy whatever bod pod or anything. It's just visual inspection, rough and ready rule, you know? But you get them down to that kind of 15%. You could maybe go into some sort of maintenance phase where it's like, yeah, we're not really trying to gain any excess muscle, but we're making sure everything is optimized. We can then make a decision whether what we want to do going forward. Generally, however, I would like people to start in a gaining phase at the lower end of that body fat range. Now, that doesn't mean 8%, doesn't mean 6%. It means somewhere around that kind of 8 to 10%, again, individualized. Like you might have the individual who came to you 25% body fat. That's just, it's too much for them to initially get down to 6% after, we'll say they did 12 weeks of dieting, they got down to 15%. They stayed at maintenance for roughly 2 weeks because you were like, let's just stay here, make sure everything's good, make a decision then where we want to go with this. I would generally say, let's continue with the fat loss, but they may not want that, So getting down from 15 to 8% for someone who has been maybe their whole life at 25%, that's a big jump, but getting them down towards the lower end of the range is probably a good idea if you ultimately want to go on to build muscle, right? So that's what I would do. I would go, let's try to get you down to the lowest we can get you body fat wise without making this excessively hard in terms of actually adhering to the diet, excessively hard in terms of actually adhering to the overall plan or impacting your life in this hugely significant way in terms of like, oh, I can only eat chicken and broccoli and I have to do that because I can never talk to my friends even because they always want to go out, like that's not what we want. We want to think of like, yes, we do want to get results, but we do want to keep sustainability in our mind, right? So that's where you'd start if you had someone who was very overweight. Again, they may have low muscle mass as well. They might be in that skinny fat category where they have very low muscle mass and just 25% body fat or more, So again, you would hope that some muscle was being built in that time as you lost body fat. We'll say it occurred over 26 weeks. So, to go to half a year, you would presume that some muscle was being built, especially if they're coming to you as a beginning. However, the whole time, your main focus is let's get down to the lower end of the body fat range, right? And then from there, I would start bringing it into again, like if I got down to, we'll say we're happy with 10%, I would just go, right, now the goal is to maintain that for 2-3 weeks and then slowly but surely go into some sort of gaining phase, right? And again, this doesn't have to be excessive. Maybe we're talking 200, 300 extra calories per day and slowly but surely adjusting that over time so that we are gaining at an appropriate rate for that individual. And again, the bog standard recommendation we'll say is 1 kilo per month for men. But you can make that go, okay, so this individual doesn't seem to have a great response to training overall, we're going to actually just lower that, and we're going to say they're only gaining 0.6 or 0.5 kilos per month, which obviously then brings in some sort of measurement error. But again, it's just an average that we're looking for overall, right? So that's what you do with that individual, or rather, that's what we would do with that theoretical individual. You could also have the individual that comes to you at 15% body fat, so they're within this range, but again, they're that kind of skinny fat. You know, you can, if you wanted, if that individual was like, no, I want to recompose, I want to do this body recomposition, you could essentially spend the first month just nailing down good processes, good dietary practices, good training practices, getting everything on point. And they may stay roughly the same body weight, but they may lose some body fat and gain some muscle. Again, we're talking about a beginner here. So they're coming to you and they're like, yeah, I've never really trained before, but you know, I'm happy with where my weight is at roughly, but I'm not happy with my body fat or my muscle mass. So you could stay there for about a month, see where body composition, how body composition changes as you really dial these things in. And for most individuals, I actually really like a month of essentially just learning about the client, you know? So we're not really in a deficit, but we are getting some results in some metrics. Now that's obviously a lot or very hard to get buy-in with clients like that. If you just say, yeah, we're basically going to spend the first month doing nothing, you know, that's very hard to get buy-in with. Where if you're like, okay, look, this is the process that we're going to bring you on. These are the kind of milestones that we want to see, and you explain it to them, they might be happy with that. They may also be like, no, actually, I need to lose the body fat first, you know. If that individual is like, yeah, I'm happy with that body recomposition plan, you can spend the first month just kind of learning the individual, you know, maybe gain some muscle, maybe lose some fat, see where things are at, and then make a decision from there. If it was me in that context, I'd be like, okay, we're going to go into a deficit. Maybe we hit it a little bit harder because, again, you're within that range. We can spend 4 to 6 weeks getting you down to, we'll say, the 10% range, you know, losing about 5% body fat rather aggressively, but not so aggressively that you can't stick to the plan. Because again, we've spent this month learning your body. We spent this month already kind of going, okay, yeah, I understand where I'm at overall. I understand how my body responds, how I feel when I'm eating a certain way, how my nutrition, my sleep, stress, all that kind of stuff impacts me. You've already got that nailed down. If they came to me and they were like, oh, 15% body fat, I just want to lose weight, I would do it over a slower time course, because again, you can still be get there again, they're a beginner, so you can still be getting some muscle gain as you lose body fat. And again, if you do that over a slower time course, we'll say 12 weeks, you can, and we'll say the other one took whatever, fucking 10 weeks, you can end up in the same point. But again, those two experiences are different. And again, it's hard to tell which one is more appropriate. So I would then go, yeah, diet, let's get down to a lower point in that body fat range. We'll say 8 to 10%. Cool. You feel good at 11%. I don't care. Like, let's go on to the next phase, which again would be like, okay, let's start slowly but surely gaining. Again, you might spend some sort of time in a maintenance phase at that lower end just to kind of get the body used to it. They used to call it a hardening phase, whether they were in the surplus or dieting. They'd be like, yes, this is the hardening phase, where it's like, we're just going to stay at maintenance roughly and get the physique, the body, you know, accustomed to this new weight, and then move on to whatever the next phase is. So those are those two individuals. If it's a female, the body fat ranges change, obviously. So for females, we'll say it's kind of 25 to 16, 15%. Again, like it's a little bit harder to tell with females, because you can have females at like 30% that have really good metabolic health and everything, whereas, you know, males don't tend to do as well at the higher body fat ranges. You know, they seem to have way more dysregulation. Like, women just seem to be more resilient to fucking everything. So we'll just say 16 to 25, but again, you could make that argument for 30, but we'll just say that range. Again, someone comes to you in those exact same two scenarios that they came to you as a male, I'm going to do the exact same thing. If someone comes to me and they're 40% body fat and they're like, yeah, I want to lose weight, I want to lose body fat, like, I'm not going to start them off in a body recomposition phase. I'm going to be like, right, let's get down to at least the higher end of that range, then we can make a decision from there. You know, same as if they came to you at the higher end of the range and you're like, all right, we can either stay at this, we can do some sort of body recomposition, but given the fact that, you know, women don't have this great response to training like guys seem to do. Now, again, obviously we're talking generalizations here, not individual. Like, you might find you have a fucking great response to training, way better than all the guys you know combined. But as a general rule, women don't build muscle as fast as guys do. So I'm less likely to put you into some sort of recomposition phase, because it's just going to have to be way more dragged out. I'd probably still go into that diet phase and be like, right, let's get you down to a body fat level that you find acceptable within that fucking whatever 16 to 25 range. And then from there, once I get to that acceptable body fat for you, we're going to stay there for 2 weeks, 4 weeks, and then we're going to make a decision. Maybe it is a slight gaining phase where it's like, yeah, we've got 100, 200 calories extra per week or per day even, and we're going to go from there. So that would be my perspective. So essentially it boils down to, I'm never really recommending a body recomposition phase unless it's like, okay, we're going to start off for 4 weeks and basically just learn what you're like as a person, how you respond to train. Like, I wouldn't even put it down as a body recomposition phase. I would just be like, this is just a fact-finding mission here. It's like, I just want to know how you respond to training, how you respond to diet. We're going to eat at a calorie maintenance level so that, you don't find that changing your diet habits is really hard because you're also in a deficit. And that would be the only real time that I would recommend some sort of body recomposition. I wouldn't even frame it as a body recomposition. It's basically just eating at maintenance, or what we think is maintenance, so that we can see how the body responds and then adjust from there. Would that be similar to how you would think of things?
Yeah, and kind of like what you alluded to there at the end, like there can be utility in these kind of maintenance phases without calling them without the intent being body recomposition exclusively. And a really good example of that is someone who maybe has a history of a poor relationship with food, let's say, and constant like cyclical dieting, like, up, down, up, down, up, down, really, just not comfortable with their body and staying at the same place. For that person, I think practicing staying at maintenance is just super important, because like having a period of time where you're just maintaining and you're saying, like, I'm not actually trying to see regular increases on the scale or decreases on the scale, and just maintaining, it can really lead to like a solidification of your habits, in one sense, because what can happen is, like, you end up really like pushing yourself to one extreme, like especially with guys bulking, they kind of end up in this mindset where need to be full all the time, need to be eating all the time, and every meal is looked at with the perspective of muscle building, as opposed to it being like, food in this social setting, having a meal, enjoying it, because there's elements of that are important. Obviously, like if you're Michael Phelps listening to this, food is fuel, full stop. Like that's pretty much what it's about. But for most of us,
it's about context. Like, you look at that, it's like people make out these huge arguments with these athletes and they're like whatever, but it's like, you have to look at that on the actual longer time scale. It's like, yes, that's their approach in the 24 weeks whatever before the Olympics. Yeah. Like, yes, that is their approach to some extent throughout the whole training cycle, because obviously they have to think of like every 4 years or whatever, maybe there's nationals or other events, world events in between that they have to factor in. But for the vast majority of that time, athletes are not being this hyper strict, hyper like, oh, food is fuel. They're like, yeah, actually, like 2-3 meals a week, like I have with my family or out with my friends, and I enjoy it. And like, yeah, it is fueling me overall, but I'm not in that, this is fucking everything mindset, So that's what kind of people think as well when they discuss that kind of stuff, where it's like, oh, they're always in this. It's like, no, they have periods of time where their focus is very much on that, and periods of time where it's like, yeah, we're a little bit more lax.
Yeah, so those maintenance phases, like that's something that I implement with a lot of clients who have a longer term fat loss goal as well. Like, you might look at it as like a quote unquote diet break, but a lot of it for me is actually just getting used to like regulating your calorie level around that level without trying to move anywhere, because it can be easy sometimes to manage your nutrition when there's a very specific goal, and you see that all the time in competitors or anyone doing a photo shoot. Like, their nutritional discipline is like perfect, on point, they're organized, their meals are prepped all the time when they're preparing, but there's no element of maintenance after that or before that. It's like, I do a photo shoot, I absolutely blow up after and have no structure, and then in 6 or 9 months again you do a photo shoot again. So there's never that point in time where you're really developing as a lifestyle. So yeah, like I have one girl who I coach, and she's a high level GA athlete, and she's essentially attained this, you know, goal, this holy grail of body recomposition, you could say, over the last year or more. And but that what that has looked like has been periods, extended periods of us being in a deficit and losing some body fat, then maintaining for a while, going back into a little bit of a deficit, and now we've been maintaining again for a couple of months. And when you look at her physique in terms of like being at the same weight as she was like this time last year, like it's pretty incredible. Like she's actually built a fairly significant amount of muscle, and again, she's an athlete at a high level, so she's got one of those higher training responses in general, so you might expect that. Also all the habits that go with that, being, you know, discipline with nutrition and training, etc. It's a lifestyle. But yeah, even with her, like getting used to that getting used to being at maintenance and adopting that perspective of, you know, food as being a social tool to some degree, food as being fuel to some degree as well, is important. I think if you can shift your mindset towards food being something that is important to fuel your training, I think that can be a big win versus it being almost like a punishment that you're trying to avoid, you know, to get to your end goal. So yeah, that's the other context that I really think these maintenance phases can be useful for, whether or not it's framed as a body recomposition phase. So it doesn't always have to be tied to that.
And just on that point as well, like something that I know you do and I'll also do with my clients is when you're trying to get them from, say, they've been tracking for a while, you know, they've been like really on point with their diet, because like generally that's how we'll start most people off. Will be like, right, we actually need to track the diet to some extent, because, you know, if you're not testing in some degree or tracking in some degree, like it's pretty hard to see where you're at or get a plan of action going, you know. And again, that's not with everyone, but like I always recommend the vast majority of people just, okay, let's just start you with tracking, you know, like let's just get like MyFitnessPal and stuff, see what you're eating. Okay, now we can start noticing trends, we can start seeing patterns, you know. Maybe then the approach becomes, here's some sort of, we'll call it a meal plan, but it's more of like a meal structure. And for some people it's going to be like, oh, here's just macros, here's maybe how we sort them out throughout the day, but, you know, it could just be like, here's a daily/weekly macro calorie goal, you know. So obviously there's different approaches to come from this, but if you've been tracking and you're kind of like, you know, I wouldn't mind getting onto a phase where I'm not really tracking, and like you do, Gary, where you're like, I'm not actively tracking my nutrition, but you've already built all these really good habits, this nutritional understanding, this nutritional knowledge, where you're like, I can actually go ahead and not track but still stay on track, you know. And I find like maintenance phases are really good for this. And obviously, like, we're not going out with the expressed, oh, we're going to body recompose, we're going to build muscle and lose fat. It's like, no, we're just going to eat roughly maintenance. So the body kind of, you know, maybe we do lose some fat, maybe we do gain some muscle, but like the goal is really just to eat at maintenance and continue to fuel performance, to continue to fuel health and all that kind of stuff. And then you can track them, or like you can get them to track while they're doing that, and then be like, okay, so what we're going to try to do is now we're just going to keep an eye to calories, and we're going to keep an eye to protein. And you can kind of play around a little bit with fats and carbs, like what you feel on a daily basis. And then you can kind of go, okay, now we're going to do some, we'll call it retrospective tracking. That's the next step I kind of bring them into, where it's like, okay, I want you to eat freely for the day and then track what you ate at night, you know, in terms of like, go back and go, what did I have for breakfast? What did I have for lunch? What did I have for dinner? Okay, so what I thought I was eating and what I was eating, they are on point with the calories I was supposed to be at, you know? Or maybe you're like, oh, actually, no, I realize I'm actually eating a slight surplus now, you know, when I do that kind of stuff, you know? And then from there, they get a better understanding of, okay, so that rough amount of food is equal to this rough amount of calories. You know, it's a nice little transition. Now, obviously, there is some sort of measurement error there, because you have to recall, like, what did I actually have for breakfast? I can't really remember if I had 2 biscuits at that tea break or I had 1, you know. So there are inherent issues with it, but eventually we want to get you to a stage where it's like you're not tracking and you're still able to stay on track. So we need to overcome those hurdles somehow anyway, you know. So this is one approach to do it. And then from there, you're kind of like, okay, so I want you to eat freely but eat at maintenance, you know. And once you're able to do that, then it's like, okay, now we can start playing around with the diet overall, where you don't have to track, but you can still stay on track with whatever it is. Like I have a few clients, especially like GA clients, where it's like, yeah, well, like we don't need to be excessively focused on the diet. It's like, you already have a huge output, you already have good nutritional practices in place because, you know, we've put them in place over time. And it's like, you can eat freely because you know now how to eat freely and stay on track with what we're trying to achieve, you know? And then obviously if we're like, okay, no, we need to really dial down on certain things, like, yes, we want to like lose body fat, or we want to really go for performance increases or whatever, we might track then again just to make sure that we're really on point. But that's where I see these maintenance phases also being very useful. And again, you can frame that as like, oh, we're going, like I call them gaintenance, where it's like, yeah, we're trying to gain strength or we're trying to gain muscle because that's always the goal overall, but we're not actually putting too much of a focus on that. If we maintain, happy days. Like, you know, if we gain, even happier days. But that's what we're trying to do overall.
Sweet. I'm just reading the questions here from Ben, although we didn't disclose his identity until now, so now it's out there. Now it's out there, Mr. Hen Baron. So, yeah, I think we covered most of the things that we wanted to touch on. The only other thing that, well, we kind of mentioned already, but the end was like, is beginning bulking at a high body fat percentage, does it lead to negative outcomes? And like as you said, with reference to the body fat ranges, like generally it's not advisable just because there are adverse outcomes to, you know, increasing your body fat over time, particularly in males, as you said, if it is that kind of central adiposity. So if you have more body fat around your midsection and around your organs, that tends to lead to more of those adverse metabolic ill health effects that you might be concerned with when you're talking about a high body fat. So yeah, it's not just about the body fat, it's also where the body fat is located on the body. And you can also make the case that, you know, what way you're building that body fat, like is it the result of structured, good, healthy diet overall, mostly, you know, other than the fact that you're over consuming calories, or is it just like binge eating all the time on junk food? You know, so there's differences there. But yeah, generally we wouldn't advise but we wouldn't advise bulking at a high body fat percentage. But at the same time, it's difficult to give the specific cutoff, which is why Paddy kind of gave those ranges. And you know, those ranges then are going to vary depending on where your body fat is actually located on the body, and also obviously whether or not you have any like clinical diagnoses, as in like if you've been to your doctor and they've said you have high blood pressure, your LDL is way elevated, you know, you've got high triglycerides, you've got all these changes that have already been identified, then it's more of a concern that you're like, oh, well, yeah, gaining body fat is a terrible idea in that context, you know, if that's what you're looking to do. So yeah, it's there's no clear-cut answer, but in general, we'd recommend trying to start from a lean starting point because of those health reasons. Also because the further you get away from a healthy level of body fat, the further you have to come back in the future, which can be difficult. And there was one more point related to that. It's okay, doesn't matter. But yeah, they're just my additional concerns.
Yeah, and with that, like obviously again, body fat ranges are just ranges, they're just averages, and obviously with averages, you're going to have inherent issues with that. So again, don't take me to be like, oh, Patrick said 15% was the cutoff. I'm like, that's not what I'm saying. You know, maybe for you it's 12. I don't fucking know. Maybe after 12% body fat, you just have terrible metabolic health. You have terrible blood lipids. You have terrible fucking, you know, circulatory system overall. I don't know. Like it's an individual thing, but for the vast majority of people, this is kind of the range. And like you were saying there, it's like you could easily figure out the exact range for you as an individual. Like you could go to the doctor and get all these tests. You could get like measure your blood glucose every single morning. You could do all of this stuff, right? And you could find out the exact range that is good for your body. But at the same time, you're just going to come down to the exact same conclusion that I just gave you, and you've spent like whatever fucking X amount of money on it, and be like, all right, yeah, so you know, for me, probably over 16% body fat is not great, you know. But I always like framing it in terms of like you actually said this just before the podcast when we were discussing this. It's like if you're going into a phase that inherently has you or has a higher potential of you gaining fat, obviously starting from a fatter position is not going to be a good idea. You know, like that's not like if that's the we'll call it the quote unquote negative outcome, like we don't want to increase body fat, you've already got more body fat. It's like the margin of error for gaining body fat is just lower overall. You have less of a buffer. Whereas if you start at 8% and we'll say 20% is just for you, just terrible metabolic health, like you have 12 whole percent to run with. You know how much muscle gain you could get while slowly accumulating 12% body fat? A fuck ton. You know how much muscle gain you can get while you try not to gain 2% body fat because you started at 18%? Not as much, So while we can get into, again, like the nuanced hormonal signaling, the nuanced like insulin sensitivity and all that kind of stuff, just on a very intuitive level, if you're like, I have a tank that can fit 20% body fat into it, and I start noticing ill health, and I start filling the tank slowly at 8% versus I start filling the tank slowly at 18%, you can already see which one of those is going to reach a negative position quicker, So just on that point, it's like, yeah, okay, so gaining or going into a gaining phase while at a higher body fat is probably not the best idea overall. Again, that's not to say that for you it can't be done. Like, you could, again, go out, get all the fucking tests in the world, go out and get everything done and be like, actually, I don't notice any negative health consequences until I'm at 40% body fat. Like, we could make an argument that, yeah, like you could start at a higher body fat percentage, but again, that doesn't mean that that's then optimized for actually gaining muscle, again, due to like insulin sensitivity and all that kind of stuff. So you can do all the testing in the world, and yes, it's an individual thing, but ultimately for the vast majority of people, staying in that range of 8 to 6%, or 8 to 16-ish, 15-ish% body fat for males, that's where you're going to notice the best return on investment from a gaining phase. And again, for women, it's that kind of, say, 15 to 25, and you will see, like, anecdotally, where people are like, oh yeah, like I got up to 16% body fat, and my gains were just coming thick and fast, and like my bench press was going fucking unreal. But again, it comes down to what we were kind of like discussing earlier on. It's like, how much of this is actually strength gain, or how much of this is actually, you've just gotten so fat that your levers have completely changed, and you now are benching 3 inches less because your chest is so fat, So, like, again, it's incredibly nuanced, and it's hard to fully tease out every single little thing. But, and also, well, it's actually easy to tease out, but it's only easy to tease out after the fact. Like, if you lose like fucking 20% of your strength because you're in a deficit, did you really own that strength? Maybe it was just changes in leverages and changes in, mechanics due to excess body fat, But yeah, I think that covers pretty much everything with this body recomposition. Basically, yes, you can gain muscle and lose fat in the same time period, not directly at the same time, but over the course of a day, over the course of a week. Yes. Is it the best approach? No. Can it be done more appropriately for certain populations? Yes. Generally, it's, anabolic users, people who have never trained before, or people who are coming back from an injury. Again, I put in that peripheral one where it's like, yeah, we can kind of call this a body recomposition for those smaller females, where it's really a deficit, but the deficit is so low that, muscle gain might actually catch up with fat loss. But again, that's purely just because I don't like dieting females on like 1,100 calories for extended periods of time, which is, what you're going to have to do if you're a sedentary 50 kilo female, and other than that, if we discuss like a maintenance phase, we'll call this a diet break or a maintenance phase. Yes, it has more utility, but I wouldn't be in my mind thinking of this as a period of time where I'm actively trying to get this body recomposition. It's basically like, yeah, if it happens, happy days, but it's not the main goal. And the main goal is to be at calorie maintenance. Do you have anything else to add to that, young Gary?
Nope, I'm pretty happy with that. The only other thing I'd probably say is that it's normal to have these concerns where you don't know what to do. You're like, oh, I don't know if I want to gain muscle or lose fat. But the best thing you can do is commit. Whichever you do choose, commit to it. Don't do like the I do for 2 weeks, kind of half-arsed, and do it the other for 2 weeks, half-arsed, because very often it ends up in that situation where you're kind of dieting a little bit, but then you're binging on a couple of days, and it's like you don't really know where you are at all. So I would pick one, I would stick to it, and I would use your past experience as well to recognize that the grass is always greener on the other side. Like when you're bulking, when you're actively gaining weight, all you think is valuable in the gym is the fact that you get leaner. All you're looking at other people, you're like, oh, they're so lean, they're dieting, I wish I was dieting. And then when you're dieting, you're thinking, oh my God, I wish I could have those big, massive bowls of protein oats with chocolate bars I used to have when I was gaining weight. And oh, I used to love how my squat felt, and I used to love getting stronger all the time. So you have to keep those things in mind. And if you really struggle with that, like I would even just write it down. Like when next time you're gaining weight actively, write down your thoughts about what you actually want, why you want to start dieting. And then when you start dieting, write down why you want to start gaining. And you'll begin to see that your your thoughts are essentially playing tricks on you, if you want to separate them from you. But yeah, to put it simply, your mind can play tricks on you, and it's always going to tell you that the opposite seems more favorable. But yeah, commit to one, get the results from it, and don't end up just kind of stuck in the mud.
100%. We also have an article on this very topic as well.
Yep.
Discuss like that no man's land where it's like, yeah, like if you're a guy, you came from this bigger position, you're like, yeah, I fill out my tops, I look fucking jacked in clothes, and people are like, yeah, he's a big guy, weights just move for you in the gym. And then you go into a diet and you're like, yeah, I'm kind of still fat, but I'm not really as full as I used to. I don't fill out the tops anymore. I'm not throwing weights around in the gym, but I'm not exactly shredded. So I just kind of feel like a smaller version of myself, And again, you have to push through that, but most people just don't. They go, oh, I'm not as full anymore, so fuck this, and going back to gaining, which is perfectly fine. Again, if that's the experience you want to have in your life is that. But again, you have to acknowledge that there are trade-offs to that, Anyway, I have nothing else to add except that it is in fact too easy. Do you have anything else to add?
Too easy. It's just too easy.
It is.